The chill of dawn was her only accomplice. In the sleeping heart of Greystone Manor, Cordelia Beaumont moved like a ghost, her worn leather shoes silent on the cold flagstones. In a small pouch tied to her waist was every coin she had saved, a pitiful sum against the vast, unforgiving world. Her freedom was a single, terrifying step away. The iron gate at the end of the long gravel drive was her finish line, the threshold between a gilded cage and an unknown future. But as the gate came into view, a dark silhouette resolved itself against the pale morning mist. It was him, and he was waiting. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with the imperious crest of the Duke of Wycliffe, a stoic griffin clutching a key. For Cordelia Beaumont, it was not a key, but a lock. Her father, Baron Geoffrey Beaumont, a man whose kindness was eclipsed only by his financial ineptitude, had read it with a trembling hand. The words were simple, stark, and stripped of all courtesy. Duke Andrew Devereux, a man known in London's financial circles as the Iron Duke for his unyielding negotiations and vast cold wealth, was calling in the Beaumont family's debt. All of it. The sum was staggering, enough to beggar them 10 times over. Their estate, Willow Creek, already mortgaged to its ancient oaks, would be consumed. They would be destitute, a stain on the lineage of a name that had once commanded respect. But the Duke, in his calculating mercy, offered an alternative. A single line at the bottom of the page that had made Cordelia's blood run cold. The debt will be considered settled in its entirety upon my marriage to your daughter, Miss Cordelia Beaumont. There was no courtship, no pretense of romance. It was a transaction. Cordelia was not to be a bride, but collateral. At 22, she had dreamed of a modest life, perhaps a marriage to a country gentleman who appreciated her love for botany and her quiet wit. Instead, she was to be shackled to a man she had never met, a man whose reputation was as formidable and chilling as the North Sea. Whispers followed his name, that he had built his fortune on the ruins of others, that his heart was as closed as the vaults in his banks, that his first wife had died under mysterious, tragic circumstances a decade prior. The wedding was a hurried, somber affair. Cordelia felt less like she was walking down the aisle, and more like a lamb being led to slaughter. Duke Devereux was taller than she'd imagined, with a severe, handsome face that seemed carved from granite. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no warmth as he recited his vows. They betrayed nothing. He was an unreadable ledger, a locked room. Her new home was Greystone Manor, a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of towers and stone that loomed over the windswept coastline. It was magnificent, opulent, and utterly suffocating. Every corridor was patrolled by silent, efficient staff, their loyalty clearly belonging to the Duke alone. Her every move felt watched, her days dictated by a schedule laid out by the severe head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. The Duke himself was a phantom. He was polite, impeccably so, but distant. They dined together in a cavernous hall, the length of the polished mahogany table, a chasm between them. He would inquire about her day with the detached interest of a landlord asking about the plumbing. He never touched her. After dinner, he would retreat to his study, a wing of the manor she was implicitly forbidden from entering, and she would not see him again until the next evening. The vast Duchess's chambers, with their silk sheets and cold fireplace, were hers alone. It was a marriage in name, a prison in practice. Desperation began to fester in Cordelia's heart. She was not a porcelain doll to be placed on a shelf. She was a Beaumont, and while her father had lost his nerve, she had not. She began to plan. Her only potential ally was Bridget, a young housemaid with kind eyes and a rebellious streak. Cordelia cultivated the friendship carefully, sharing stories of her old life, lending her books, and treating her not as a servant, but as a confidant. It was Bridget who told her of the tradesman's gate on the far side of the estate, less frequently used, and with a lock that was old and temperamental. It was Bridget who helped her gather a small bundle of practical clothes, a loaf of bread, and a wedge of cheese. And it was Bridget who procured a schedule of the watchman's patrols. For a month, Cordelia observed, she learned the rhythms of the house, the clatter of the kitchen staff starting their day at 4:30, the heavy tread of the groundskeeper passing her window at 5, the changing of the gate watch at dawn. She practiced picking the rusted lock on her wardrobe with a hairpin until her fingers were nimble and sure. She studied the local maps she found in the library, charting a path to the nearest port town, from where she could book passage on a ship to anywhere. The night of her escape was moonless. A thick fog rolled in from the sea, clinging to the manor in a damp shroud, a perfect cover. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she dressed in the dark, pulling on a simple wool skirt and blouse. She left behind every jewel, every silk dress the Duke had provided. She would take nothing that was his. In her place, she left a short, defiant note on her pillow. A cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage. I have chosen freedom. Slipping out of her room, she moved through the sleeping house, a shadow among shadows. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4, each dong a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. She made it to the kitchens, past the scullery, and out a small service door into the damp gardens. The fog was so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead, but she knew the path by heart. The wet grass soaked the hem of her skirt. The scent of salt and damp earth filled her lungs. It was the scent of her escape. The tradesman's gate was at the end of a long, winding path, overgrown with ivy. It looked ancient and formidable. Her hands trembled as she inserted the hairpin into the lock. It resisted. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was hopeless. Then, with a prayer on her lips, she jiggled the pin just so, and there was a loud, grating click. A wave of triumphant relief washed over her. She pulled the heavy iron gate open just enough to slip through and closed it gently behind her. She was out. She was free. She took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to run, to put as much distance between herself and Greystone Manor as possible before the alarm was raised. But she didn't get a single step. A figure emerged from the fog, as silent and solid as the standing stones on the moors. He was leaning against an ancient oak tree just beside the gate, as if he'd been waiting there for hours. In the pre-dawn gloom, the faint glow of a cheroot illuminated his face. It was Duke Andrew Devereux. He took a slow drag from the cheroot, the orange tip flaring, casting his chiseled features in a demonic light. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. The look in his stormy grey eyes was something far worse, a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. "Did you truly think," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that cut through the fog, "it would be this simple, Cordelia?" Cordelia's blood turned to ice. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the damp earth. The small pouch of coins at her waist suddenly felt like a lead weight, a pathetic symbol of her failed rebellion. The fog swirled around the Duke, making him appear more apparition than man. "How?" The word was a choked whisper, all the air having been stolen from her lungs. He pushed himself off the tree, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He dropped the cheroot and crushed it under the heel of his immaculate leather boot. "You have a tell, Cordelia. When you are planning something, you hum. A particular little tune by Mozart. You've been humming it for 3 weeks. Furthermore, he continued, taking a step closer, you requested 3 specific books from the library last week. A detailed atlas of the British coastline, a novel about a woman who escapes to America, and a treatise on rudimentary locksmithing. It wasn't a particularly difficult puzzle to solve. Humiliation washed over her, hot and bitter. He hadn't just caught her. He had been observing her, analyzing her like a scientist studying an insect. Her meticulous planning, her secret hopes, they had been nothing more than a source of mild amusement for him. And Bridget, he added, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, is my servant, not your co-conspirator. Her loyalty was purchased long before you arrived. The final betrayal struck her like a physical blow. Bridget, kind, sympathetic Bridget, with her shared whispers and encouraging nods. It had all been a performance. The Duke had not only known her plan, he had been a silent architect of her failure, a puppet master pulling the strings. She had never stood a chance. Come, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He gestured back toward the gate she had just so triumphantly opened. It is cold, and you are not dressed for the weather. Tears of rage and helplessness pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. With her back ramrod straight, she turned and walked through the gate, back into the prison she had just escaped. He followed, his presence a heavy weight behind her, and with a soft click, he locked the gate properly with a key from his waistcoat pocket. The walk back to the manor was the longest of her life. The great stone house loomed out of the mist, its windows like vacant eyes watching her return in shame. The Duke did not speak, and his silence was more damning than any tirade could have been. It was the silence of absolute power, of effortless victory. He led her not to her chambers, but to his forbidden study. The door, which she had only ever seen closed, swung open to reveal a room that was the epitome of its owner. Dark wood paneling, shelves filled with leather-bound books from floor to ceiling, a massive desk of dark oak, and a fire roaring in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and whiskey. He gestured to a worn leather armchair by the fire. Sit. She remained standing, wrapping her arms around herself. I prefer to stand. His eyes narrowed infinitesimally. It was the first flicker of emotion she had ever seen from him. Annoyance. Sit, Cordelia. This is not a request. Defeated, she sank into the chair. The leather was soft, and the warmth from the fire began to seep into her chilled bones, a comfort she did not want to accept. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to her. Brandy, he stated. Drink it. She looked at the glass, then back at his impassive face. I don't want it. Nevertheless, you will drink it. You are on the verge of a chill, and I have no desire to pay a physician's bills. His pragmatism was more insulting than cruelty. Her hand shook as she took the glass. The fiery liquid burned a trail down her throat, but it did its job, chasing away the shivers. He stood by the mantel, swirling the brandy in his own glass, the firelight catching in the facets of the crystal. Let us be clear, he began, his voice low and even. This will not happen again. The world outside this estate is not the romantic adventure you read about in your novels. It is a dangerous place for a lone woman with no connections and a pitifully small amount of coin. You would not have lasted a week. That would have been my choice to make, she retorted, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. Any fate is better than being your possession, a piece of property you acquired to settle a debt. He took a slow sip of his brandy, his gaze fixed on the flames. You believe that is what this is about? Your father's foolish investments? What else could it be? You don't know me. You clearly do not want a wife. You have everything you could possibly need. This was a demonstration of power, nothing more. A way to crush my family and add a duchess to your collection of assets. For a long moment he was silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When he finally looked at her, his grey eyes were dark and intense, and for the first time she saw something beyond cold indifference. She saw a deep, weary anger, but it wasn't directed at her. You have no idea what you are talking about, he said softly, the words laced with steel. You see a cage. You are meant to see a cage. It is imperative for now that you believe you are a prisoner. Cordelia stared at him, bewildered. What are you talking about? Meant to see a cage? He drained his glass and set it down on the mantel with a decisive click. Your freedom would have been a death sentence, and not from poverty or misfortune. There are people who would be very interested to know that Baron Beaumont's daughter is unprotected and desperate. People to whom your father owes much more than just money. A chill, entirely unrelated to the dawn air, crept down her spine. What people? What are you saying? I am saying, he replied, turning to face her fully, his expression unyielding, that your father's troubles go far beyond bad business, and I am saying that your presence here, as my wife, is the only thing keeping those wolves from your door. This marriage is not your prison, Cordelia. It is your sanctuary. He offered no further explanation. He simply watched her, his face a mask once more, leaving her to grapple with his cryptic words. Was he telling the truth? Or was this just another, more sophisticated form of manipulation? A way to make her a more compliant prisoner by convincing her the world outside was more dangerous than the man who held the key. Her heart, which had been so certain of its course just an hour before, was now lost in a fog as thick and disorienting as the one outside the window. She looked at the man before her, the Iron Duke, her husband, her jailer. And for the first time, she realized she didn't know him at all. The chains she felt were real, but their purpose, their origin, was suddenly terrifyingly unclear. Life after the failed escape was subtly, yet profoundly, different. On the surface, nothing changed. The manor was still silent, the staff still efficient, and the Duke still a distant, enigmatic presence. But Cordelia now felt the unseen walls of her cage had been reinforced with steel. Bridget, her former confidant, now wouldn't meet her gaze, her face a mask of polite servitude, the shared whispers and smiles gone as if they had never been. It was a constant, stinging reminder of her gullibility. The Duke's cryptic words in his study echoed in her mind. This marriage is not your prison. It is your sanctuary. She tried to dismiss them as a clever lie, a way to ensure her compliance, and yet a sliver of doubt had been planted. Who were these wolves he spoke of? What could be worse than the public ruin her father had faced? Andrew, for his part, seemed to have shifted his strategy. The absolute distance he had maintained was replaced by a new, unsettling proximity. He began to join her for breakfast, a meal he had always taken alone in his study. He sat at the far end of the long table, reading the Times, but his presence was a palpable weight in the room. One morning, he lowered his newspaper. "I am told you have an interest in botany," he said, his voice startling her. Cordelia looked up from her plate, surprised. "I do. The East Conservatory has been neglected for years," he continued, folding the paper neatly. "The structure is sound, and the irrigation system is functional. It is yours to do with as you wish. Order whatever plants and supplies you require. Give the list to Mr. Hobson." He then stood, gave a curt nod, and left the room, leaving Cordelia staring after him in stunned silence. The conservatory was a magnificent glass structure she had longingly admired from a distance, assuming it was another locked and forbidden part of the manor. The gesture was unexpected. It was not kindness, not in the way she understood it. It was a concession, a gift, but a gift with invisible strings. "Be a good prisoner, and you may have a new toy for your cell." She accepted it. Defiantly, she poured her frustration and confusion into the work. She spent hours in the glass house, clearing away years of dust and neglect, her hands raw from pulling weeds and scrubbing glass. She submitted an extensive list of seeds and tools to a stony-faced Mr. Hobson, the Duke's butler, half expecting the request to be denied. 2 days later, everything arrived, delivered by a wagon from London. As she worked, she watched. She became a student of Greystone Manor and its master. She noticed things she had previously missed. The Duke wasn't simply a recluse who buried himself in ledgers. Twice a week, a man with the hard, watchful eyes of a hawk would arrive for a private, late-night meeting in the Duke's study. He was not a businessman. He dressed like a dock worker, and his face was a road map of old scars. They would talk for hours, their low voices, a distant murmur Cordelia could never quite decipher. She also noticed the Duke's library wasn't solely comprised of books on finance and industry. Tucked away in a small alcove, she found a collection of poetry. Keats, Byron, Shelley, the spines well worn, as if they had been read and reread many times. Inside one volume, a pressed flower, a faded forget-me-not, was tucked between the pages of a love sonnet. It was a jarringly sentimental discovery, a crack in the granite facade of the Iron Duke. Who was the woman who had inspired such a gesture? His deceased first wife? The thought sent an unwelcome pang through her chest. One evening, a storm rolled in from the sea, lashing the manor with wind and rain. A clap of thunder rattled the windows of the dining hall, and Cordelia flinched, dropping her fork with a clatter. "Does the storm frighten you, Duchess?" Andrew asked from his end of the table, his eyes on her. "I have never been fond of thunder," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. He said nothing more. But when she retired to her chambers that night, she found a fire already crackling in her hearth, chasing the damp chill from the room. A cup of chamomile tea sat steaming on the bedside table, and a new book lay beside it. Not poetry, but a fascinating illustrated guide to the coastal flora of England. There was no note, no explanation. But she knew it was his doing. These small, calculated acts of, not kindness, but consideration, were more unsettling than outright cruelty. A cruel jailer was easy to hate. A considerate one was a dangerous paradox. He was tending to her needs, providing for her interests, all while keeping her firmly locked away. He was making the cage comfortable, and that was the most insidious trap of all. Her resolve began to waver. Was it possible he was telling the truth? She thought of her father, a man she loved but knew to be weak. He had always been too trusting, too eager to make a grand impression. It was plausible he had fallen in with a dangerous crowd. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for answers, she broke her own rule and approached the West Wing, where the Duke's study was located. She didn't dare try the door, but she found a small, seldom used sitting room that shared a wall with it. Pressing her ear to the cold wood panelling, she could hear the muffled sound of Andrew's voice. He was not alone. The other voice was sharp, cultured, and oozing a contemptuous arrogance. "Patience is wearing thin, Devereux," the voice said. The girl has been tucked away for 2 months. My associates are growing restless. They want what they are owed." "What you are owed," Andrew's voice cut in, cold as ice, "is nothing. You preyed on a desperate man. The contracts Beaumont signed are fraudulent, and you know it. Fraud is such an ugly word. I prefer leveraged persuasion. The Baron was a fool. He gambled on ventures he couldn't afford with money he didn't have, my money, and the collateral he offered was charmingly naive. Access to his family's shipping routes, patents he no longer owned, and most interestingly, his daughter's hand." Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. "She is my wife," Andrew stated, his voice flat and deadly. "The Duchess of Wycliffe. She is untouchable." A cold, mirthless laugh echoed through the wall. "For now, but you can't keep her locked in that fortress forever. Sooner or later, she will step outside. And when she does, my dear Duke, she will be mine. My claim, after all, predates yours." The name. She had to know the name of this monster. She strained to listen, praying for a clue. "You will not go near her, Montfort," Andrew warned, his voice a low growl. "This is your only warning." Lord Percival Montfort. The name shot through Cordelia like a bolt of lightning. He was a rising power in Parliament, a man known for his silver-tongued speeches and rumoured for his ruthless, shadowy business dealings. He had visited her father once, a year ago. She remembered his oily charm, the way his eyes had lingered on her, making her skin crawl. It all clicked into place. The debt, the sudden marriage, Andrew's strange warnings. This wasn't about her father's finances. It was about her. She was the prize in a deadly game between 2 powerful, dangerous men. And her husband, the cold, calculating Duke, had just declared her his territory. He wasn't her jailer. He was her guard. The revelation that she was not a prisoner, but a protected asset, shifted the very foundations of Cordelia's world. The fear she felt for Andrew began to transmute into a different, more complex and terrifying emotion. Fear for him. Lord Montfort was not a man to be trifled with. His power was in whispers and shadows, in ruined reputations and sudden financial collapses. Andrew had placed himself directly in Montfort's path. Cordelia's perspective on Greystone Manor changed. The silent servants were not spies reporting on her. They were a loyal garrison. The high walls were not to keep her in, but to keep Montfort out. The Duke's distance was not born of indifference, but of a calculated, all-consuming focus on the threat that loomed over them. She started to see the man, not the myth. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes in the mornings, the tension in his jaw as he read his correspondence. She saw him walking the grounds late at night, a solitary figure patrolling the perimeter of his domain, of her sanctuary. He was bearing this burden alone, never once letting the mask of cold control slip in her presence. A new determination took root in her heart. She would not be a passive pawn in this game. She was the Duchess of Wycliffe, and if this was her fortress, she would learn its secrets and help defend its walls. Her first target was the study. Before, it was a forbidden sanctum. Now, it was the enemy's war room, and she needed to understand the battlefield. She didn't dare try to enter when he was there. Instead, she waited for one of his rare trips to London, trips he always announced, with a clipped, formal notice the day before. The day he left, the manor felt unnervingly empty. With her heart pounding, she walked to the west wing. She had assumed the door would be locked, but to her surprise, the heavy oak panel swung open under her touch. He had left it unlocked. Was it a test? Or did he simply not consider her a threat? The room was just as she remembered it, dark, masculine and imposing. This time, however, she was not a frightened captive, but an intelligence gatherer. She moved to his massive desk. It was immaculately organized. Piles of papers were neatly stacked and weighted down. She scanned them quickly. Shipping manifests, reports on commodity prices, correspondence about a new railway line. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She tried the drawers. The first two held stationery and pens. The third was locked. This had to be it. Remembering the skills she'd honed for her escape, she retrieved a hairpin from her coiffure. Her fingers were steadier this time. After a few tense moments of probing, she felt the telltale click. The drawer slid open silently. Inside, there was only one item, a thick, leather-bound ledger. She lifted it out and placed it on the desk. It wasn't a financial ledger. The columns were headed with dates and names. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. It was a meticulously detailed record of Lord Montfort's criminal activities. Forgeries, blackmail, industrial sabotage, witness intimidation. It was all there, documented with dates, locations, and the names of shell corporations he used to launder his money. A significant section was dedicated to her father. Andrew had compiled a complete history of Montfort's leveraged persuasion. He had evidence of how Montfort's agents had systematically ruined Baron Beaumont, forcing him into ever more desperate loans at predatory rates, all with the ultimate goal of seizing his assets and claiming Cordelia. But it was the last section of the ledger that made her gasp. It was titled Eleanora Devereux, his first wife. The entries were different here, less clinical, more personal. Andrew had documented Montfort's obsessive pursuit of Eleanora years ago, before her marriage to him. Montfort had been a spurned suitor, and his pride had curdled into a venomous obsession. The final entries were clipped, the handwriting tight with suppressed emotion. October 12th. E. receives threatening note. Perfumed with Montfort's signature cologne. He is toying with us. October 15th. Carriage bolts tampered with. Driver caught it before we left the city. Montfort's man, seen near the stables, has vanished. October 19th. Her nerves are shot. She refuses to leave the house. He has imprisoned her with fear. The final entry was a single, devastating sentence, dated a decade ago. October 23rd. The fall on the grand staircase. The doctors called it an accident. I know he was in the house. Cordelia slammed the ledger shut, her hands trembling. It wasn't a mystery. It was a murder. Andrew believed. No, he knew Lord Montfort had killed his first wife and had made it look like an accident. And now, Montfort's obsession had transferred to her. This wasn't just a business rivalry. This was a vendetta. Andrew hadn't married her just to protect her from blackmail. He had married her to avenge his first love and to stop a monster from repeating history. His coldness, his control, his constant vigilance, it was all a shield, forged in the fires of a terrible loss. He wasn't unfeeling. He was terrified of feeling that pain again. She carefully put the ledger back, locked the drawer, and left the study, her mind reeling. The ghost of Eleanora Devereux haunted the halls of Greystone Manor, and suddenly Cordelia understood why Andrew had kept her at such a distance. Looking at her, he must have seen a ghost of the past and a potential ghost of the future. That evening, she sat in the conservatory, her sanctuary, surrounded by the new life she had cultivated. But she felt no peace. She thought of the forget-me-not pressed in the book of poetry, a symbol of true and undying love, a love for Eleanora. What was she in all this? A replacement? A strategic move? A duty? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. She was grateful for his protection. She admired his strength, but a new, painful question arose. Could he ever see her, Cordelia, Or would she forever live in the shadow of the woman he was trying to avenge? When the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel announced the Duke's early return, she didn't feel the familiar dread. Instead, she felt a profound, aching sorrow for the man who was fighting a decade-old war in the silence of his own heart. She stood up, brushed the soil from her hands, and for the first time walked out to greet her husband. Andrew was stepping down from his carriage as Cordelia emerged from the Manor's main entrance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the drive, and in the twilight, the Duke looked impossibly weary. When he saw her waiting on the steps, he stopped, his expression unreadable. It was the first time she had ever voluntarily sought him out. "Duchess," he said, his voice a low rumble. There was a faint note of surprise in it. "I didn't expect you." "I heard the carriage," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I trust your business in London was successful?" It was the kind of polite, distant inquiry she had always made, but this time the words felt different. They were an opening, a test. He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face, as if looking for the motive behind this breach of their unspoken protocol. "It was productive," he finally answered, ascending the steps to stand before her. They stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. She could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. She thought of the ledger, of the name Eleonora, of the decade of pain he had carried alone. "I am no longer afraid of you, Your Grace," she said softly, the words taking both of them by surprise. His carefully constructed mask flickered. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Perhaps you should be." "No," she insisted, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I was afraid of a jailer, a cold-hearted tyrant who bought me to settle a debt. I was not afraid of a man." She took a breath, the next words a leap of faith. "I am not Eleonora." The name hung in the air between them, stark and shocking. Andrew's face went pale, his composure shattering like glass. For a terrifying second, she thought he would erupt in fury. Instead, his eyes, those stormy grey seas, filled with a raw, unguarded pain so profound it stole her breath. "How do you know that name?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Your study was unlocked," she confessed, her heart hammering. "I read the ledger. I know about Manor Fort. I know what he did." He looked away from her then, turning his gaze to the darkening horizon, his profile a hard line against the fading light. "What you read was the conjecture of a grieving husband. I have no proof. Nothing that would ever stand up in a court of law. Just a soul-deep certainty that has haunted me for 10 years. But you are gathering it," she pressed. "The evidence against him. That is what this is all about. You are building a case, a fortress of facts, so high and so strong that when you finally act, he cannot escape." He turned back to her, and the mask was gone. In its place was a man stripped bare of his ducal authority, a man carrying an impossible weight. "He is clever, Cordelia. He never touches the filth himself. He uses layers of intermediaries. For every thread I pull, he has 2 more woven." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And now he has fixed his sights on you. I brought you into this war. It was the only way I could legally shield you, to place you under my name and my protection. But it was a monstrously selfish act. I have put you in the path of the very same danger." "You did not put me there," she countered, a fierce, protective instinct rising within her. "Montfort did. My father did, with his weakness. You have built a shield wall around me. But you cannot fight this war alone, Andrew." Using his given name felt both shockingly intimate and perfectly natural. He flinched slightly, as if the sound of it from her lips was unfamiliar. "I will not have you be collateral damage," he stated, his voice hard with resolve. "Your only duty is to remain within these walls and stay safe." "And what if I refuse that duty?" she challenged. "I am not a porcelain doll to be kept on a shelf, and I am not a ghost to be avenged. I am your wife. This is my home, my life," he threatens. "This is my fight, too." He stared at her, a tumultuous storm of emotions swirling in his eyes. Shock, fear, and something else, a reluctant admiration. For months, he had seen her as a charge to be protected, a fragile piece in a dangerous game. Now, for the first time, he was seeing a potential ally, an equal. "What are you proposing?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I am proposing an alliance," she said, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "A treaty. You have been observing Montfort from a distance, but I knew him. He visited my father. He spoke to me. He believes me to be a terrified, helpless woman, your prisoner. Let us use that. Let me be your eyes and ears in a world you cannot enter. The world of society, of drawing rooms and whispers where a man like Montfort builds his reputation. It was a reckless, dangerous idea, but it was the only one she had. To cower behind the walls of Greystone forever was not living. It was waiting. She would not wait for Montfort to make his move. She would help Andrew force his hand. "He wants to lure you out," Andrew argued, the protector in him rising to the surface. "It's too dangerous. Then we shall set the stage ourselves," she insisted. "A grand ball. Here, at Greystone. We will invite everyone of consequence. We will invite Montfort. We will bring the battlefield to us, on our terms. He will not be able to resist the chance to see his prize on display, to taunt you in your own home." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the distance that had defined their marriage began to collapse. He saw not the frightened girl who had tried to flee at dawn, but a woman of steel and fire, a duchess worthy of the name. He had married her to protect her, but somewhere along the way, she had forged herself into a weapon. "A ball," he repeated slowly, the idea taking shape in his strategic mind. "A public stage, with 100 witnesses." "Exactly," she said. "He thrives in shadows. We will force him into the light." A long silence fell. Andrew's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched into fists at her sides. Gently, he reached out and covered one of her hands with his own. His touch was warm and firm, a current of electricity that shot up her arm. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than cold formality. It was not a gesture of passion, but of accord, a sealing of their new treaty. "Very well, Your Grace," he said, his eyes meeting hers again. There was a new light in them, a flicker of hope. "We shall have our ball." The preparations for the Greystone ball began at once, transforming the somber manor into a hive of activity. For the first time since Cordelia's arrival, the house felt alive. Candelabras were polished, floors were waxed to a mirror shine, and invitations on thick cream card, sealed with the Devereux Griffon, were dispatched across the country. The news that the reclusive Duke of Wycliffe was hosting the event of the season sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. It was a statement. The Iron Duke was emerging from his fortress. For Cordelia and Andrew, it was a declaration of war. Their dynamic shifted entirely. The cavernous dining table was no longer a chasm between them. It was their strategic map, littered with guest lists and seating charts. The chilly evenings were now spent in the Duke's study, their study, planning every detail of the gambit. Cordelia was a revelation. She possessed a keen understanding of social politics, identifying Montfort's allies, his debtors, and those who secretly despised him. Lord Ashworth detests Montfort since their railway deal soured, she'd point out, tapping a name on the list. Seat them together. Ashworth's discomfort will unsettle Montfort. Andrew, in turn, shared the intricacies of his investigation. He revealed that he had an agent, the hawk-eyed man she had seen, whose name was Ronan, tracking Montfort's financial trail. Montfort is over-leveraged, Andrew explained one night, pointing to a column of figures. He's using the promise of his engagement to you, and the Beaumont shipping routes he believes he controls as collateral for a massive loan. If that engagement is publicly and undeniably proven to be a fantasy, his house of cards will collapse. Their plan was twofold. Cordelia's role was to be the bait. She would appear not as a downtrodden prisoner, but as a radiant, confident duchess, utterly devoted to her husband. She would engage Montfort, playing the part of a woman who was perhaps charmed by him, but bound by duty, subtly luring him into a public display of possessiveness. Andrew's role was the trap. He and Ronan had prepared a dossier containing irrefutable proof of Montfort's fraud, ready to be delivered to the proper authorities. But they needed one final piece, a public act of aggression or an undeniable threat from Montfort, witnessed by the powerful men and women who would be in attendance. They needed to strip away his veneer of respectability in a single, devastating stroke. As they worked together, the last vestiges of formality between them crumbled. She saw the dry wit that lay beneath his stern exterior. He discovered the fierce intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. One evening, as she struggled to decipher a coded entry in his ledger, he came to stand behind her chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as he pointed out the key. The warmth of his touch lingered long after he moved away. A new, fragile intimacy grew between them, born of shared purpose and mutual respect. It was more potent than any flowery courtship. The night of the ball arrived, a clear, star-studded evening. Greystone Manor was ablaze with light, music drifting from the ballroom out into the night. Cordelia stood at the top of the grand staircase, the same staircase where Eleonora had fallen, looking down at the arriving guests. She was dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk, the Devereux diamonds glittering at her throat. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was the Duchess of Wycliffe, and she was ready for battle. Andrew came to stand beside her. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, a figure of immense power and control. But when his eyes met hers, she saw the raw vulnerability beneath the surface. He was placing his trust, his hope for justice, and her safety in this one night. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. "He will underestimate me," she said with a confident smile. "He will see a woman. He won't see a warrior." A flicker of a genuine smile touched Andrew's lips. He offered her his arm. "Then let us go to war, Your Grace." They descended the staircase together, a united front. Their appearance silenced the room. The sight of the famously reclusive Duke and his beautiful unknown Duchess was a spectacle. Montfort arrived late, making a grand entrance. He was handsome, charming, and radiated a predatory confidence. His eyes immediately found Cordelia. He made his way through the crowd, his smile like a shark's. "Duchess," he said, bowing over her hand, his lips brushing her knuckles a moment too long. "You are even more radiant than I remember. The country air agrees with you, though I must confess, confinement does not suit your spirit." "Lord Montfort," Andrew's voice was pure ice, stepping slightly in front of Cordelia. "A pleasure to see you could attend." The verbal sparring began. For the next hour, Cordelia danced the delicate dance they had planned. She allowed Montfort a waltz, keeping him at a careful distance while appearing beguiled by his flattery. She spoke of her quiet life at Greystone, hinting at a loneliness he could interpret as unhappiness. "A rare bird like you should not be caged, my dear Cordelia," he murmured as they danced, his hand tightening on her waist, "even if the cage is gilded." "My husband provides for my every need," she replied, her voice sweet, but with an edge of steel he failed to notice. She saw Andrew across the room, his face a granite mask, watching their every move. She saw Ronan, dressed as a footman, lingering near the terrace doors, ever vigilant. The moment came during a lull in the music. Montfort drew Cordelia toward the less crowded terrace, under the pretense of getting some fresh air. This was it. "Your father made me a promise," Montfort said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Devereux may have your name, but you were meant for me. We both know this marriage is a sham, a business deal. Once his vengeance against me is sated, and it will fail, he will cast you aside. I, on the other hand, would cherish you." "My lord, you are mistaken," Cordelia said, pulling her arm from his grasp. "My marriage is no sham." Montfort's charming facade finally cracked. His eyes hardened. "Don't play the fool with me. I know Devereux. He is obsessed with a ghost. You are nothing but a tool to him. When I have finished with him, I will come for you. And you will welcome it." He reached for her, his fingers biting into her arm. "You belong to me." "I think not." Andrew's voice was a deadly calm. He seemed to have materialized from the shadows, Ronan at his side. Several prominent guests, including Lord Ashworth, had drifted closer, drawn by the rising tension. Montfort released her, his face contorting with rage. "Devereux! We were just having a private conversation." "I heard it," Andrew said, his voice ringing with authority. "As did Lord Ashworth and Sir William. You have just threatened the Duchess of Wycliffe, in her own home." He took a step forward, shielding Cordelia with his body. "Your gambit is over, Montfort. Your loans are being called in as we speak. Your associates have been furnished with proof of your fraud. You are ruined." Panic flashed in Montfort's eyes, replaced by pure, desperate fury. He saw his world collapsing. He lunged, not at Andrew, but at Cordelia, grabbing her, pulling her against him. "If I am ruined, I will take my prize with me." It was his final, fatal mistake. Before anyone could react, Andrew moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying. He struck Montfort's arm with a precise, brutal blow, forcing him to release Cordelia. As she stumbled back, Ronan and two other guards subdued the sputtering, defeated lord. The ballroom fell into a stunned silence. Andrew ignored the gasps, his only concern for Cordelia. He went to her, his hands framing her face, his eyes frantically searching for any sign of injury. "Are you all right?" he breathed, his voice raw with fear and relief. "I am," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his. In that moment, with 100 pairs of eyes on them, the world fell away. There was no plot, no vengeance, no ghost of the past. There was only the two of them. He was not the Iron Duke, and she was not the bartered bride. They were simply Andrew and Cordelia. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss for show. It was a desperate, profound expression of everything that had remained unspoken between them: the fear, the admiration, the relief, and the deep, burgeoning love that had grown in the crucible of their shared danger. When they broke apart, the silence of the ballroom was replaced by a wave of whispers. Lord Percival Montfort, a ruined and disgraced man, was being dragged away. The war was over, and in its aftermath, something new and beautiful had just begun. The Greystone Ball became the stuff of legend. In its wake, Lord Montfort's empire crumbled, and he fled the country a ruined man. The oppressive tension that had haunted the manor vanished, replaced by a peace that felt as bright and airy as the conservatory Cordelia now called her own. The external war was won, but for Cordelia and Andrew, one final question remained. Their marriage, born of strategy, now faced a future without a defined purpose. Andrew found her there, among the orchids, a few days later. The air was warm and fragrant with new life. He didn't speak of the plants or the weather, but approached with a grave purpose in his eyes that made her heart brace. "Cordelia," he began, his voice low and earnest. "This marriage was a necessary deception. I bound you to me to protect you and to serve my own quest for justice. Now the threat is gone. You are free." He produced a legal document from his waistcoat. "This is an annulment petition. I will not hold you in a cage. If you wish for the freedom you sought on that foggy morning, you shall have it. I will provide a settlement to ensure you can live as you choose, owing me nothing." She looked from the document to his face. He was offering her the very escape she had once risked everything for, giving back the choice he had taken away. She thought of the desperate girl at the gate, running from a cold stranger. But that stranger was gone. In his place stood Andrew, a man who had secretly battled monsters for a decade. The life she had was not a cage, it was a partnership. "And what if I don't want to be free of you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. A look of stunned hope crossed his face. "Cordelia, the girl who tried to run away was escaping a monster of her own imagination," she said, stepping toward him. "She didn't know the man who lived in this house. I do. This alliance has become something more for me, Andrew. I have no desire to leave." She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat. "And for me," he breathed, his hand covering hers. "When Montfort seized you, I knew my vengeance for the past was over. It had been replaced by a desperate need to protect you. Not as a duty, but because a life without you in it is unbearable." He dropped the annulment papers, letting them scatter on the floor. "I am asking you to choose to stay. Not as a duchess, bound by contract, but as my wife, my love." Tears of joy welled in her eyes. "My choice was made the moment you stood beside me on that staircase." He framed her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a kiss of adrenaline or relief, but one of slow, deep promise. A promise of a shared future, of a love that had bloomed not in a sunlit courtship, but in the crucible of a shared war, emerging all the stronger for it. The sun streamed through the glass, illuminating the new life all around them. It was another dawn at Greystone Manor, but this time there was no gate, no escape, only the home they had chosen to make in each other. And so, Cordelia's desperate escape at dawn led her not to the freedom she thought she wanted, but to the love she never knew she needed. Her story reminds us that the cages we fear are often of our own making, built from misunderstanding and assumption. True freedom wasn't about running away. It was about finding the one person who makes you want to stay. Andrew and Cordelia's journey from jailer and prisoner to partners and lovers shows that even the coldest facades can hide the warmest hearts, and that the greatest love stories are often forged in the most unexpected fires. If you are captivated by the twists and turns of Cordelia and Andrew's fight for love and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with a fellow romance lover, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next tale. Thank you for listening.